say the word trip and we'll just roll right into it.
Yeah, ready when you are.
Okay, fantastic. All right, thanks you both for doing this. I think it's going to be an interesting discussion. This is personal to us all, but there's also a lot of really interesting things to tell the public about when it comes to what happened to the funding of both of our organizations. So Phil, you are the manager, president. Are you still the president or CEO?
I am the CEO, the board president. To avoid confusion, we separated president as the board slot. I am the CEO of Southern Oregon PBS.
And so that makes you my boss. And then Paul, go ahead and introduce yourself.
I'm Paul Westhelle. I'm the executive director for Jefferson Public Radio, which is based on the campus of Southern Oregon University, which is our licensee in Ashland.
Fantastic. Yeah, so just in terms of introductions, tell me more about the organizations you lead. We'll just start with you, Phil. Tell me about SOPBS. I already know a lot, but for the folks at home.
We cover about 18,000 square miles in Southern Oregon and Northern California. I think it's 6 counties in Oregon and 2 in California. It's about 500,000 people. We provide 4 over-the-air broadcast television channels, 1 streaming-only channel, and we do 24-hour-a-day broadcasting, and we have been in business since 1977.
Fantastic. And Paul, JPR?
JPR is the NPR affiliate for Southern Oregon and Northern California. We broadcast to about a 13-county region of the area with a potential audience of about 1 million people. We provide 3 program services simultaneously, which is pretty unique among public radio stations nationwide. So we do an all-news service, on classical music and NPR news service, and a music discovery service as well. So all those things go on simultaneously in our studios at the same time. So we air lots of local programming, and we supplement that with programs from National Public Radio and other providers as well.
Mm-hmm. And Phil, we do local programming as well. Do you want to give me an overview? Maybe excluding the show that we're on right now, because that's one of ours.
There's Us As We Are, which we're on now. There's also a lot of interstitials. Southern Oregon Responds, Southern Oregon Experience, which is history. Southern Oregon Responds is profiles of local nonprofits. And then we have limited series, Energy Horizons, last fall. We've done history documentaries, cultural documentaries. It all depends on the funding.
Yeah, so that gets us to the topic of funding. Which one of you wants to kind of summarize what happened with CPB over the last couple of months?
I think it starts with Project 2025. There's a chapter in Project 2025 specifically about eliminating the Corporation for Public Broadcasting. If you know the history of CPB, you know it has been attempted to be defunded going back to the Nixon administration. So when President Trump was inaugurated, he issued some executive orders that were kind of attempting to do some things, but then in June, Congress introduced a rescission bill to claw back funding that already had been appropriated in January. And then narrowly passed the Senate. There were some slight changes in the House, but eventually it passed by a limited margin, and that's a little over $1 billion over 2 years, 70% of which is distributed to public radio and TV stations.
Mm-hmm. So that affects both the national organizations, PBS and NPR, but then also more so smaller stations, the member stations of both those organizations. Do you want to tell me about kind of the way that that impact is spread across the network?
So for SOPBS, it's 37% of our fiscal 25 budget. And then we would use that and other donations to pay PBS dues. So if PBS has fewer member stations, or NPR, then they have a smaller pool with which to do their work. But there are some stations, especially in rural areas, where the percentage is much higher, 50, 80, 90%. So you'll see smaller stations, especially tribal stations, rural stations, really have a tough time end of this calendar year when we would normally get the CPB distribution.
And how about for JPR, Paul?
For JPR, CBB funding amounts to about 15% of our operating budget annually. And I think it's important to note there's been a lot of criticism from the Trump administration about PBS and NPR as national organizations, when, as Phil articulated, the vast majority of CBB funding came to local organizations like SOPBS and JPR to fund emergency alert warnings, to fund local news operations, to fund the broadcast costs of getting our signal to small rural communities around the region. So the vast majority of funding actually came to local stations, the majority of which are broadly supported by the American public and really Congress. There have been many, many attempts, as Phil has kind of articulated something about the history of funding cuts. There have been attempts before, and usually in the president's original budgets, that have tried to cut CPB, and generally Congress has reinstated those cuts because, for the very fact that public broadcasting is broadly supported by the American public, both Republicans and Democrats.
So yeah, that's 37% of SOPBS's budget, 15% of JPR's budget. I'll start with SOPBS. What does that money that we get from CPB primarily pay for?
It pays for a lot of fixed costs. So rent, utilities, equipment, people, and it is the cornerstone that you build your budget on for the subsequent 2 fiscal years. A lot of people don't realize it's 2 years of funding that was rescinded. So I've worked at stations where it paid the PBS dues. I've worked at stations where it paid the mortgage and the building. So each station is able to use it for different purposes. Here, it's been more fixed costs, rent, people, equipment.
And how about for JPR? Is it kind of the same, or is there a little bit of a different arrangement of the pieces there?
Yeah, there's a lot of flexibility, and sometimes we use the funds mostly to accommodate the ease of grant reporting, but it's mostly used for people in our shop. We have a staff of 15 full-time people and about 12 part-time people, and that's the majority of what we use it for. We also do spend a little bit of it on infrastructure and paying lease costs on mountaintop sites that we have a lot of mountaintop sites around Southern Oregon and Northern California.
Mm-hmm. So probably the most burning question, when I've been out in the field and people want to ask me about what's going on with public media funding, they're all like, so have you been shut down? So the question is this a survivable thing for our local public media here in Southern Oregon?
I think it is.
Yeah, I think it is too. Yeah, we have a lot of faith in our audience, and that's really what it's going to come down to. Local support is going to be the most critical factor. Initial results are really good. I'm sure we'll talk about that more. But I think it's survivable if we all step up as a community.
Absolutely, yeah. So what are the strategies to try and make up for some of that lost funding?
So we have a combination of expense cuts and increased revenue. So we have 3 positions that are open. 2 were retirements. 1 was an extended leave. So we're not replacing those people. We made some other cuts here and there, small percentages, not eliminating anything. And then we're very happy that the response in June, July, and August has been very strong, about 50 to 80% over last year in membership support. Major giving has increased 5-fold in the last 6 months. And foundation giving, you can see the interest from the foundations. They want to help as well.
Yeah, has JPR also experienced a boost in charitable giving?
Yeah, we've had a really massive increase since June as well, and we've replaced, as of today, about 62% of the lost federal funding. So we've lost $525,000 and have replaced a little over $300,000 of that in about a month's time. So yeah, the audience has stepped up in a very dramatic way. It's very gratifying and humbling, I think, for our organization to see the community step up so quickly. So I think we're on a solid path to developing a new sustainable business model for the future, and that really is a challenge. Nonprofits often do emergency fundraising efforts, and those are sometimes very successful. We have to convert this to a sustainable business model for the future.
Mm-hmm. So I understand that on some level, these types of organizations kind of have a runway for making these sorts of changes. Here at SOPBS, we have reserve funding. Maybe you have something similar at JPR. Do you want to tell me about kind of the reserves that are being sat on that are kind of giving us that runway?
So over the last 3.5 years, we've accumulated enough reserves to offset the loss of federal funding for 2 fiscal years. So in addition to the cuts I mentioned, our board has approved cash that we've got in the bank to offset the loss of CPB funding. In July, we got what we believe is our largest individual gift ever, which might give us a third year. So that gives us a roadmap. So we've got 3 years to figure out what this new model looks like. And that could be partnerships, that could be the return of federal funding. There's still talk about putting us in individual appropriation bills. We'll see. But I think that gives us time to work through what's coming next. What that will be, nobody knows.
Is there a different equation there for JPR at all?
A little bit. We do have reserves of about 4 months of our operating budget. Our operating budget's about $3.5 million a year, but we won't deficit spend right away. We intend to have a balanced budget right away, and that's a little bit in the difference of 15% versus 37% that we're able to do that. But we believe we need to be sustainable right away. And that's what we're going to work to do. And I think we're well on our way to do that for this next fiscal year. So we're going to work hard. We're going to communicate with our audience passionately and calmly and try to get a balanced budget right away, which we think we can do.
Yeah. Does that involve having to make any budget cuts at this point?
For us, it does not. I've been meeting with my staff to bring them up to speed on what's going on, because there's a lot of fear in the air, obviously, towards people, and we don't see any major cuts. Cuts are going to be our last resort, because at JPR we're such a lean operation with 15 full-time people and a bunch of part-time people running 3 consecutive services. I mean, I would challenge any other public radio entity in the country to operate on that level of efficiency and effectiveness. So we're already running very, very lean, and we're efficient already. So there are some budget cuts that we can make, or budget savings that we can make. We're going to look for a new streaming provider that might save $10,000 or $12,000 a year. We're going to do what we can on the expense side. We always do. So on our side, we are going to look to make up the revenue on the income side, and then by the end of the year, the calendar year, we're just halfway through our fiscal year in December, we'll make adjustments if we need to.
One addition to that, PBS's board last week voted to reduce dues, one-time reduction for PBS stations, and our PBS dues, which are usually about $400,000 a year, have been reduced to about $260,000 a year. So that's about a $140,000 savings that get put into that pool to give us a glide path towards whatever's becoming next.
And NPR did make a similar adjustment as well. I think we saved about $50,000 this year on NPR dues. They set up a pool of $8 million that were dedicated only to stations that received more than 10% of their funding from CPB. So we qualified for that, applied, and were awarded a discount on our dues.
Nice. Yeah, just for people who don't know, what are these dues we're talking about? What are PBS dues? What are NPR dues?
So all PBS stations, if you see the little logo with the head on the station, that means they paid dues to become a member station, which is very different than a commercial affiliate. We pay PBS money to be a member. The commercial model is the other way around. So the stations get money for being the local, like a dealership for a car company. So that gets you the national programming, Sesame Street, Masterpiece, NewsHour. It gets you some other things, web support, satellite infrastructure, a lot of different things that the average viewer doesn't see behind the scenes. And PBS takes those dollars, pools them, and provides services to the whole system.
And NPR is a similar model. We pay a core fee that gets us Morning Edition and All Things Considered, the major news magazines, and then we purchase other programs on an a la carte basis that are sort of tied to revenue tiers. So they're scaled based on a station's ability to pay. So overall, we pay about $300,000 to NPR in a calendar year.
Mm-hmm. One of the things I've learned about in terms of a function of CPB that seems very critical and that you might not think much about before it goes away, and then when you lose it, it seems like a big deal, is music licensing. I understand for JPR, that's a really big deal because you guys have the classic radio station, which is really dependent on that kind of legal infrastructure that CPB was providing. I wonder if you can tell me about that little issue.
Well, CBB used to just do joint licensing with the major music licensing organizations. And so a radio station, in order to play music, has to pay rights. If each individual station are out there negotiating their own rights, that's time consuming, expensive, and difficult. And when it was consolidated at the CPB level for a national organization, it was cheaper, easier, and more effective. So that is one of those things that we're trying to kind of solve right now as a system. NPR has taken the lead. The music rights are paid through the end of this calendar year through December from CPB. After that point, there's going to have to be a new way to do it. So we're trying to figure that out as a system, obviously collaborating. There's strength in sort of collaboration. So we're taking on those efforts right now.
And you talked about people commenting, are you going away? The Corporation for Public Broadcasting as an entity is announced they are closing at the end of the federal fiscal year, September 30th. There will be a skeleton crew of senior officials to do multi-year agreements to tie those up in nice little bow and finish those projects. But the music rights infrastructure, satellite leases, all types of different things that they did on our behalf, and were able to negotiate much better deals than I would be able to go to ASCAP, the main licensing entity, and say my little station in Southern Oregon wants to get a break on licensing music, and they wouldn't even call me back.
Is there any hope for CPB to return, or is that a done deal? Is that gone forever? Or do you think there's any way that might somehow reincarnate into our system again?
It would be difficult because by law they had to distribute 70% of the revenue to stations. So restarting something like that has been built over decades would be very difficult. I think they're allowed 4% for their own administrative costs. So they don't have a big pool of money that they can extend their entity. And I believe that would have been something that Congress kind of said, wrap it up at the end of this fiscal year.
And my take on that is I think CPB probably will end up going away. It was formed and enabled by legislation. The Public Broadcasting Act of 1967 formed CPB by statute. If there's no federal support, there probably, is no reason for it to exist. But I do think that other entities will come up in the private nonprofit sector to try to sort of fill the gap and provide sort of the collaborative structures that help us all operate more effectively and efficiently.
So that puts us very firmly in kind of new waters, new territory. The future is going to be different than the past, and we're not probably going to really ever go back to that old model.
Current times are different than the past. I mean, think of what you've done in the last 3 months that are very different than you've done previously in your career.
Yeah, at JPR, change has always been in our DNA, in the culture of the organization. We've developed new services, we've adapted to the digital space like every media entity has had to do. We've tried to meet our listeners where they are and where they're evolving to be in the future. So change is just part of the game, and so we don't try to resist change very much. We try to adapt to it. And so, as I said, we're trying to be calm. We're trying to be very focused on the future. And we're trying to be agile so we can adapt. And that's really what the culture is sort of demanding right now.
There's a sense I've had that here in Southern Oregon, our two stations are really like on the almost like the bottom of a certain threshold where it's like it seems like stations that are smaller than SOPBS or JPR are really having a hard time and like are really faced with a serious near-term shutdown. But we're kind of lucky in a way. Like we have the reserve funding here at SOPBS, we have this boost in charitable giving, and it does look like there are paths forward. I wonder if you want to reflect on that at all, kind of our luck of the draw.
Well, it's interesting. You mentioned the threshold for the relief from NPR dues. For PBS stations, it was 30%. So we're both just over that line of where the national entities decided to give us a cut in our dues. We're large, small stations, small, medium-sized stations. Anytime you draw a line and divide a large group of entities like TV or radio stations, there's going to be people that are right on the border. And we seem to be in both radio and TV on that border. That said, you have people here whether it is retirees or people, younger generation, that feel public service media is important. They want to support it. And it's the largest percent of our budget. It's 50%. So it's about $300,000 more than the CPB appropriation was. So we've built it on that support to begin with, and I think that's served us well in both cases, that we're able to make an honest request, and it's been met in a positive way.
And for JPR, I mean, we're actually budget size wise in the top half of the stations. We're probably towards the bottom of the first quintile as far as budget size is concerned. That's because we have this very expensive plant to maintain. It costs about $1 million just to operate our plant in a year before we put an ounce of programming on it or a minute of programming on it. So it's, the rural station element is, and the mountainous terrain of the West is expensive. And so in that regard, we're sort of, we have many, like you say, a foot in each world. We're a little bit bigger organization budget size because the three services allows us to serve more audience. That audience, again, has been very, very generous to us over the years. It's been when you look at some of the per capita giving levels, some of the most generous giving in the country when you look at per capita giving. And yet, the market is unmeasured right now by Nielsen, so we don't get audience data. So we're actually so small that the audience firms aren't even interested in serving the market. So on some levels, we're a very small operation. On other levels, not so much.
On the TV side, Nielsen combines Medford and Klamath Falls. I think we're market 139. So we're right on the bottom. I think they go to 200 markets. One thing Paul mentioned I want to talk about, I came from the Midwest. You have one tower, goes out about 50 miles, and there's another market. Their tower meets you in the middle. Here, we have 12 towers. You have 30 something.
I don't even count them. It's too depressing.
And we do share towers in some cases, but somebody's got to pay the lease, and often that's on public land, and you've got to fill out the paperwork, and you've got to keep the utility access, and you've got to clear the roads when it snows, and somebody has to be able to get up there and service it when it goes out. And that's part of the fixed cost that I don't think the average viewer or listener realizes. And that over-the-air service, universal service, is a key part of our DNA, and it's what emergency alerts have been built on. Educational programming, arts and culture, that we served 98, 99% of the population.
Yeah, the physical reality of our landscape, I think, is something that I'm impressed constantly when I get into infrastructure issues, which this was a major thing when we did Energy Horizons, of how much the landscapes of Oregon kind of define a lot of the economics and the decisions that have to be made. And that certainly applies to us because, like what you said, I'm thinking about Matt, like snowshoeing up a hill, and he's being paid to do
or having to wait until the spring to go up and do maintenance because he can't get to the location.
Our engineer is rappelled out of a helicopter to get to a site, slept in a transmitter location on Gray Butte, which is on Mount Shasta, overnight. Thank God the transmitter generates some heat, so he was warm. But those are the kinds of things that you do to provide a signal to the communities that we broadcast to.
So I think some people who are watching this are probably following my logic here and thinking, well, okay, we're talking about small organizations, and it's the small member stations that are most vulnerable now with the funding cut. You have SOPBS over here and JPR over there, and they're separate organizations. The obvious logic is, why not combine together and become a larger organization? Or you also have up north, OPB sitting there as a larger organization. Are there scenarios for that kind of a thing, mergers, acquisitions, these kinds of larger business moves, not so much in the near term, but in the medium and long term?
There have been discussions. Paul was on the search committee that hired me. So we have been talking about those types of things since I started 3.5 years ago. But if you think about a university has their licenses, a 501c3 nonprofit has our licenses, we both have governance structure, trustees that would be involved. And not very many people know this. I have a huge file in my office, but OPB actually had the license for Medford in the 70s, but turned it back into the FCC because they couldn't raise the money to get it started. So there's 50 years of history with OPB. The hard part is it's not like TV where you just walk into a conference room and sign the deal and there it's done. There's all kinds of complications. I think what we've started doing partnerships, you have been on Jefferson Exchange, I've been on Jefferson Exchange. We share marketing materials. We're doing underwriting spots for Us As We Are on JPR. I think that's the starting point, but the devil is in the details. And if you've ever tried to combine any two organizations, no matter the size, there's always something that you don't think of that pops up that you have to deal with. Think of all those transmitter licenses. Those would have to be dealt with. If one of us moves to the other location, you'd have to manage that. We can't just shut down for a week and say, see you on Tuesday because we'll be back. It's an incredibly complex situation, but I think we're headed in that direction.
Yeah, and I think we need to be more creative in looking at ways that we can collaborate to drive further efficiencies, and I think we will be. As Phil mentioned, there are legal issues, FCC issues, regulatory issues to overcome, but hurdles are meant to be jumped, and so I think we're going to have to look at more creative ways to either, just share resources, back sort of business resources like development resources and engineering resources. That might be possible, to looking at other kinds of models that might, become more of a full partnership. So I think all these things are on the table. I think we have to look at them creatively and thoughtfully about how to build a more sustainable and resilient organization. On the OPB front, I think you can do things more efficiently, but I don't think what we give up in having a little more cost of local organizations, I think that's worth having in Southern Oregon. I mean, would as many people give to a Portland-based organization that give to a locally governed organization, two locally governed organizations in Southern Oregon? I think not. Is it better to have the sensibility? Southern Oregon is a much different place than Portland. Is it better to have that local sensibility in programming decisions and in staffing and in all the things that we do? I think it is. And I think it's worth stepping up to support a local organization. And I think so far our audience does as well.
And I would add to that, like, their traffic software is different than our traffic software. Their fundraising software is different. Our fundraising software is different. And I've worked at joint licensees where they have both, and it is not the natural fit that you might think, because there are things that radio producers take into consideration when they produce their work that's very different than what you might go through when you do your work. So we're related, but we're not necessarily siblings.
Sure.
And to Paul's point, I agree. You don't have Southern Oregon Field Guide from OPB that's exclusively about Southern Oregon. So you would lose that local editorial voice, local employees, local boards, local advisory boards, and local support.
And I would also note that we're already collaborating, with OPB and actually all the stations, public radio stations in the Northwest, pretty extensively. I'm actually the vice chair of a group called the Northwest News Network that is 6 stations around the Northwest, 3 in Washington State and 3 in Oregon, OPB, KLCC, and JPR, which we meet regularly and we share content freely across our newsrooms. We have advanced coordination so that a newsroom is not trying to cover something that's already being covered, so that local resources can then be deployed in a way that's not duplicative of something already being done. So, OPB is up in, is in the Portland and Salem area, so they're doing a lot of statewide politics coverage. We don't have to do that. So we can focus our reporters down here in Southern Oregon and Northern California covering local stories. And then we share that up north, which is, they're very interested in the stories that come from Southern Oregon as well. So I think there's a really healthy now collaborative environment in public radio. It didn't always used to be here. And so we're already taking advantage of the collaborative efforts of the stations and trying to, leverage capacity.
Yeah, I mean, I myself, of course, have been part of the collaborative efforts between JPR and SOPBS in the past. There was a time when we were doing sort of a version of Us As We Are for air on JPR, but to your point about how radio and TV are not maybe as much siblings as some people might expect, I found the process of making radio to be very challenging in a way that was surprising to me, because I think when I approached it, my assumption was like, oh, it's just a TV show without audio.
I'll just take the audio off my television show, yeah.
Right, just put that audio and put it on the radio. And it's like, no, it's a very different process. There was a lot more expositional writing I had to do that I found to be very challenging. And so, yeah, the crossover was not obvious.
Yeah, audio storytelling is not just TV without the pictures. It's a whole different animal.
Absolutely.
Which you got very good at, by the way.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah, it's a good... it's a good work. It's good work, and I'm thrilled. That narrative audio storytelling has achieved such a renaissance with podcasting, and people back in the day when TV was invented, they was like, "Oh, that's the death of radio," because who's going to listen to the radio? It's just TV without the pictures. It's less, but it survived a lot of years, and I think it's really experiencing a renaissance because so there is something about not seeing everything and experiencing it in a way that. Your ears experience rather than your eyes.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when you're in that kind of multitasking mode, driving or playing video games even, like having something to just listen to and not have to watch is it's almost like the key to being entertained while you're in those types of modes. I wonder if you guys want to talk more about that kind of like adaptation to new mediums like that. Like with radio, there's a sense that radio is kind of transforming into podcasts over time. Yeah. With TV, there's a sense that it's kind of transforming into like YouTube or streaming services over time.
So Paul mentioned something replacing something else. Media is a long history of something that was going to replace the previous entity. So live performance was going to be replaced by movies, and radio and TV were going to replace the movies, and laser discs were going to replace VHS. And I think it's just a further expansion. The average U.S. citizen spends over 35 hours a week with media. And it's getting to the point where you can slice or dice it any way you want to consume it. And I think it's, as Paul said earlier, it's meeting that consumer where they want to be. So a lot of people don't realize half our audience is watching on streaming. So broadcasting is only half of what we do. When I started, it was one channel with standard definition, went off the air at midnight, and it might be in stereo. Now everything's in stereo. You're on 24 hours a day. It's high definition. We have 4 broadcast streams, 1 online stream, and then we put these things out online, whether it's YouTube or the PBS app, and they find huge audiences. So to me, it's just the evolution from a mass broadcasting model to a personalized, individualized model. What we do is still high quality, it's just how we distribute it. So if you think of a retailer, our distribution and our shelf space model has changed. Ken Burns is still going to get an audience regardless of how he's viewed. Sesame Street is still going to have value to small children. But the PBS Kids audience is something like 80% digital now. So they have the broadcast and the multicast channel, but they also have podcasts, they have games, they have teacher resources, they have homeschooling resources. So it's all part of delivering to the individual what suits them best.
And I think it's the same for JPR, a little bit different, but mostly the same. I mean, in the old days, we might have an average quarter-hour audience on the radio of 6,000 people, and maybe we have 3,500 or 4,000 now, but the audience online, people consuming, a feature about a local topic is now consuming it on demand, going to our website or having it pushed to our Facebook page and then shared in that way. So I think it's just different platforms, but content is king, quality content, news that's in-depth, fact-based, fact-checked, is all what takes the resource. And how people listen, if they listen on their phone through a cell connection or at home on their computer through an IP connection or a fiber connection or over the air. I still think radio is a great modern wireless technology. Many places it's the best way to get our signal. So we have to be in all those different places. I guess on the content side of it, we are mindful of our size and scale, and so we are trying to create content that's multi-platform. So for instance, we do several segments on the Jefferson Exchange. Your segment was one of them, but we do a segment on local small businesses that we then broadcast on the radio on a regular basis, and then create a podcast that we push out to Apple and all the other ways, Spotify and all the other ways people consume podcasts. So those things are pushed out into different platforms. So it's a little more work. You have to be innovative and adaptive all the time, but we are doing that work right now, and that's sort of how the system has evolved. What's here today is probably not what will be here tomorrow.
And on the television side, that intermediary is also a big factor. So without getting too deep in the weeds, cable and satellite systems and streaming systems pay commercial channels to broadcast their signal, air their signal. Non-commercial educational channels don't get that. So that was always considered in exchange for the CPB appropriation, we would forego that. It's called retransmission consent. Is that up for negotiation now? Who knows? One of the things, I went back and reread the chapter on Project 2025, and it makes sense now. In addition to eliminating CPB, Project 2025 said we should also go after their non-commercial licenses. And if you're familiar with the national underwriting investigation, also I believe top 10 markets, the FCC is actively trying to take away stations' non-commercial licenses.
Yeah, the content strategy and the distribution platforms are interesting because I'm 27. The number one way I watch PBS content is through YouTube. I watch Frontline episodes that are uploaded directly there.
News Hour every night.
Same exact thing. And that's what I do with this program. This interview is going to be uploaded to YouTube, and then the program that it sits in will be slightly edited down will also exist on YouTube. And then over on the JPR side, I do listen to a lot of JPR content, but primarily through your website. Mm-hmm. At the same time, though, anecdotally, when I'm in the field and people approach and say, oh, I like the show that you do, almost every time they're an over-the-air viewer. Just you can tell, like from the demographics, it's often older people who are usually still over the air, or maybe cable viewers, but in any sense, like they're in that traditional television market. When you had that, the loss of CPB funding, and then also some of the requirements, like you were saying, that kind of go along with that, an idea that emerges is like, well, could some stations switch to a totally digital model and kind of cut the costs of broadcast infrastructure? How do you guys feel about that concept?
I have a colleague that is considering that. He's in an overlap market where there's 3 PBS and NPR stations within the same market. So PBS dues are based on population. So he's part of a major top 30 market, but he's in a community that's 75, 80,000 people. So he doesn't have the membership base to pay for the large market dues. He's considering exactly what you described. Now the question is, I think that's completely contrary to the viewer experience that they expect from us. If we broke into Masterpiece every 15 minutes and ran 5 minutes of commercials, all that membership support goes away, I think. Yeah. So I think it's a slippery slope because we have built this reputation based on the quality of our content, fact-based journalism. We are the country's largest performance halls when we broadcast because we reach such a large audience. The hard part is always translating that to individual support. And I think if you go to a commercial model, you're cutting off your nose to spite your face.
FJPR, I don't think that's feasible. I think all the national numbers say that over 80% of audio listeners still consume terrestrial radio. So terrestrial radio is doing pretty well. So I think it's still our heart and soul, and the digital services are where the future is, and it will be gradual. It's like a lot of disruption in all kinds of businesses. It's going to be gradual over the years, and at some point, I think what you're describing will be probably feasible. It's not today.
That's interesting. Earlier, we were talking about budgets and budget cuts, and I'm glad to hear that neither organization is at this point facing immediate budget cuts. But I wonder if you can put yourself in the shoes of station leadership for smaller stations that are looking at budget cuts and are really facing the axe when it comes to some of the programming that they do and the services that they provide. How would you prioritize some things over others? How do you even begin that process of deciding what has to go and what can we keep?
Well, the hard part is you can't cut like 10% of your transmitter costs or 10% of your utility costs. So eliminating something entirely is a pretty big step. I look at it as our service to the public, so public safety, emergency alert system. We wouldn't cut that. I look at local voices. So whether it's Us As We Are, a show like Energy Horizons, the interstitials we do, OPB is not going to do those in this area. So that would be second. I have made a concerted effort to protect the jobs of the people who work here. So that would be next. After that, it's a combination of finding efficiencies. So for example, we're trying to reduce credit card fees. We spend over $20,000 a year in credit card fees. So if we can get people to go to a bank transfer, we find $20,000, roughly. It's things like that around the edges, a little help from PBS on the dues, some money in reserves, save $20,000 here, $100,000 there, $50,000 there. You can get there and not have an extreme loss of your cash reserves. The small stations like Alaska, New Mexico, the tribal stations, the rural stations, they are going to have an emergency happen and they will not be on the air. And then people will, unfortunately, I hate to say this, I think there will be loss of life because it could be a storm, it could be a flood, it could be wildfires, and they are not aware of what's happening because that one local entity is gone. And that's heartbreaking. That's the case we tried to make with Congress. And some people it resonated, but it didn't touch everybody.
For JPR, I mean, I think all of our services are sort of rooted in self-sufficiency and self-sustainability. So I don't think we get anywhere by cutting services. If you cut classical music, you lose the revenue and the loyalty of that audience. If you cut more modern contemporary music, you lose that revenue. If you cut news, you lose that revenue. If you cut local news, you know, what's the case for existing if you're just retailing national programming? I think we're long past those days. So I think all of these various things, I mean, it's sort of like, trying to decide between your children. You know, you've got these things and they're core to what you're doing, and cutting them is not going to get you anywhere. So it's sort of rising up and having the audience aspire to being able to support the entity on a more local basis. You know, nationally, I think in the past figures are about 1 in 10 members of our audience supports the station. We have to do better than that. But if we did 15% of our audience, we would be in good shape. So are these things, achievable? I think they are. And I think it's worth it. I think it's worth it to have a locally based organization, and the services, the breadth of services that we provide a lot of service in the small communities that we serve, but I think it's worth it. But it doesn't matter to me if I think it's worth it. It's what the audience thinks.
So I want to go big picture and kind of talk about why this defunding thing happened. It's been an issue, like you spoke to, for a long time since the Nixon era. There's been an effort to try and defund public media, but why? What are the arguments that are being used? I think it's, we see things or hear things like, oh, it's federal over, it's waste of federal funds, or, oh, it's biased media and the federal government shouldn't pay for that. But what are your thoughts on why this happened, and what do you think of those points that get brought up?
I think you mentioned the two big ones, and I've heard them from members of Congress. The perception of bias, which is not necessarily actually bias, but the perception of bias, and people who just don't want certain things to benefit from tax dollars. And I would add to that tax dollar, it's $1.60 per person per year for both public radio and public TV. So we leverage the federal dollar 5-6 times over. I think there is just a perception, and a lot of these people don't watch or listen, that they don't want their tax dollar and 60 cents to go for something that they don't use. We have cases where people want to opt out of library districts or fire districts. So I think that's a societal shift. I think the perception of bias is something that they were able to latch onto to get additional support. If you look at surveys, both sides, Republican, Democrats, 60, 70, 80% of viewers and listeners support funding for public broadcasting. I don't think there's anybody in Congress or the executive branch who got those kinds of numbers. So the question becomes, who has the majority in which house of Congress and what they can pass? And in this instance, in the Senate, it was a tiebreaker vote. The vice president cast the deciding vote on taking it out of committee and bringing it to the floor. So you're talking razor thin margins. I know on the TV side, over 3 million calls and emails went to Congress on this issue. So the question becomes, are they serving their constituents or are they serving something else?
What do you think, Paul?
Well, I think it's a little different than that. I think the circumstances that we talk about in history, Republicans have had far more bigger majorities in Congress and the White House and have not ended funding for public broadcasting. So I think what you're seeing here is a further polarization and partisanship of the media in general, where there are conservative outlets and outlets that are perceived as not conservative. And I think this presidency, I think the Trump administration in particular, is very transactional in what it believes the press. You're either friendly to the administration or you're not. And my judgment is, if you're doing your job, you're not friendly to the administration. That's not unique to Donald Trump. The press has always had a challenged relationship with every presidency, from Obama to Clinton to everybody in between. So I think if you're doing your job, you're probably making some people angry. And then if they have a lever of federal support and they're willing to use it, I think that's that's where we're at. I think it's a broader attack on the press, on the mainstream press. The press is trying to show citizens accountability of the administration, to shine a light on things it is doing. I think that's really what we have here, is not a general appreciation and value for the role the free press plays in American democracy, which most presidents have had. I think this president sees it very transactional, and that's the difference, I think, because I don't think you should be able to have a 4-vote majority in the House and still get this done. So I think this is a very unique time in American history. And I think we're engaged in a time where some of these institutions are being kind of taken down. And I think that's where we're at right now. So I think the public needs to stand up if we're going to have this kind of accountability that we need to have.
And you also look at what's happened with CBS, Paramount, and Skydance settling a lawsuit in order to get regulatory approval. ABC settled a lawsuit. Both legal experts said were very winnable lawsuits, but they still settled. You have the president calling the press an enemy of the people, monsters. There's all kinds of other things he's called the fourth estate. There is an adversarial relationship there that manifested itself in this one possibility to get a win. And I think this was used as an opportunity, one, to flex the administration's muscles a little bit, because I believe the president put on social media that he would primary anybody who, on the Republican side, voted for public media funding. And I think also a loss of what Paul talked about, often bipartisan support, and we saw a little bit of that, but not enough to salvage the bill, where people in rural areas, deep red states, their senators supported and understood what public media does. I think you saw that with Lisa Murkowski a little bit. and with Susan Collins a little bit, but ultimately they ended up voting to take the money away.
The bias question is really interesting. Do you guys feel like maybe the national organizations especially almost got pulled too much into a conversation about bias that was like a redirection away from some of the stronger points that they could make about the reason for us to exist?
I was happy to see a gentleman named Ed Ullman also testified in that hearing. He runs the Alaska State Network, and I thought he was much more effective because he talked about specific things that were done with the federal appropriation in his state. The discussions with the CEOs of NPR and PBS became almost like gotcha moments. It was like, here's this one instance where this happened, and can you defend that? And I think for communicators, we kind of lost control of the narrative.
And I think a lot of it was cherry picking. You know, I listen to NPR, and there are times that there's programs and segments that I roll my eyes at, frankly. But I think in general, you know, what we have in media these days, as I said, you have the political right watching Fox News and listening to Newsmax, and you got the political left listening to MSNBC and getting their own sources of news. And then we say, well, the country is polarized. Well, duh, right? I mean, that's why. It's like we are living in different universes of information, and we see different things based on what those media outlets say. So I think, you know, NPR properly kind of covering the breadth of the issues from a multitude of viewpoints and letting the listener come up with their own determinations about important events that are facing us, I think are critical. I mean, NPR just recently did an interview with Steve Bannon. It's a much different experience if Steve Inskeep is interviewing Steve Bannon than a Fox News person is interviewing Steve Bannon. I remember a segment during the election where they talked about with a bunch of Latinx people on the border that supported the wall, against you know, limiting immigration. An excellent segment. So there are examples of this all across the broadcast spectrum. And I think if you really took a look at the body of work that NPR takes on a national level, and I can certainly say that JPR takes on at the local level, we make a big effort to understand our own biases, to weed them out of the journalism process, to acknowledge them and move on to them and have the strongest viewpoints on different sides of issues. We feel like we did our best work when we have the strongest viewpoints being articulated on different sides of a controversial issue. And that's what we intend to do. And I think that's NPR's values as well. I've been involved in enough conversations to know that.
And over time, it's interesting you get as many complaints from both sides.
Yeah. I know that very well.
So that to me says we're kind of hitting a sweet spot. I think it's also important to realize that, at least on the PBS side, we have independent journalists. Whether it's Frontline or Independent Lens or POV, you have independent documentaries as well. They're not from PBS or NPR nationally. These are independent voices. And we actively, and one of the things CPB funded, go out and search out those other voices so that we get those multitudes of perspectives. And it's not just a newsreader with the company line from corporate. 350 PBS stations all doing this work. I used to tell people, we can't have a conspiracy. We're not organized enough to get everybody together and develop the plan. So I look at it as something that they were able to communicate effectively, that they were able to use as the main focus of what they were trying to do.
Mm-hmm. I think a lot about bias as a reporter myself. And, you know, obviously it's like, in addition to being a reporter, I'm a person and a citizen, and I have opinions about these things, and some issues more than others, of course. I mean, I think when we talk about public media defunding, my and your bias is very clear. We like public media funding. We're unhappy with the administration for having taken it away. But I think my approach to that, when I realize I have a bias, is to try and just be transparent about it and let it come out in the journalism, but then still demonstrate my ability to do, like what you're talking about, Paul, like a fair interview with someone on the counter side of whatever my belief is. A good example of that was our last piece on the library issue over in Josephine County. That was one where it was just obvious that I, as a public media, nonprofit media person, I'm going to be sympathetic to libraries and their cause. I use them. We love collaborating with the library and using their spaces. And so when we take on a story that's about, well, some people want to defund that library or take its lease away or want to see the library change in substantial ways, I have to acknowledge that I'm a big appreciator of the library. But on a higher level, I want to be a reporter, and I want to find those points that maybe work against the library, but like what you say, the best of those arguments. And so I'm kind of a nerd for those things. And it's what I wish people would understand us reporters to be more often, is nerds instead of political agents of some kind. But I wonder if you wanted to say more about how you think reporters in the public media space should approach bias. Do you think that my approach through that kind of transparency lens is the right one, or do you think that there are other ways to handle that?
Well, I don't think just being transparent about an opinion that you have is a good thing. I think in the journalism world, best practices have gone away from asking a reporter to be objective, which is really impossible because we're human beings, to acknowledging our bias and then trying to weed it out in a story and to try to look for the strongest viewpoints that are against, to be the devil's advocate. That's probably what you're talking about. So are the libraries well managed? In the example you gave, how are they using their money? You ask those questions and you might be surprised at the answers, right? That even though you're conceptually a fan, you're saying, well, that's not a good way to use somebody's money. I want to dig into that more and reveal it. Now, if you dug into it and would not reveal it based on what you found, that would be extremely bad and an example of your bias that would not be consistent with all the journalistic ethics and standards that I know that JPR adheres to. So, that's kind of the example. You want to be a devil's advocate on every side of an issue, and it lets you learn about things that you didn't know. And I'm sure that is part of the exciting part of being in this business for you.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I love that when it's like, surprise, like you didn't know that. With Energy Horizons, that was the big, surprise. Like, this is way more complicated than you originally thought. Transitioning to renewables, that's really hard to do. Let's explore why, and maybe we can come to some robust answers about how to approach this. And I loved that about doing that series. But what do you think, Phil?
Journalism has evolved, and it's still evolving. So what was the Washington Post doing during Watergate is very different than what Frontline does today. And that route changes and it goes in different directions. And I think we need to be cognizant of false equivalencies. This side did this side did that, and making them perceptually equal, and what's called whataboutism. It's not responding to the question, it's throwing out another example to distract people from the original question. And I think that's the hardest part, is get people to stay on topic, answer the question, versus we've gotten so glib and well-spoken, there are all kinds of people who can just toss off a response that doesn't really answer the question. So that persistence, and in this environment, it's often met with abuse. Press secretaries, corporate spokespeople, trying to get to the actual question. Like Paul said, devil's advocate. And I think there's a case to be made for something called the citizen's agenda, where you are the citizen's representative because they can't go to that meeting, they can't attend that hearing, that the journalist stands in for the average citizen. And if you keep that perspective, it's hard, but eventually you get to the end result, which is what research has shown. If you have local news, you have more efficient local government, you have higher bond ratings, you have less nepotism, you have less no-bid contracts. Our role as the fourth estate actually works.
All right, so my last big question. This is one that I don't think I would even know how to begin answering, so whatever you say, I will find fair. But looking out 5-10 years in our future, where do you see our organizations being at that time? That would put us in 2035, which to me feels like an unimaginably far away future. But
I have a TV-specific answer. So the FCC is currently debating what is called ATSC 3.0. which would mean an entire replacement of all our technical infrastructure, unfunded mandate. They're trying to push the deadline up to 2030. So if we're in the current financial situation where we're trying to create a new model and that comes in at the same time, then it will drastically change what we do and who we are. So it might be we only do cable, satellite, and streaming. We don't have the broadcast part of it. And I think there's a question whether broadcast television exists beyond that, that it just goes purely to a stream, an IP-based, a cable, whatever delivery mechanism, that broadcasting on the television side ceases to exist. Now, these things go in cycles. I may be wrong. But that technical standard, if you remember the digital television, there was some subsidy of that by the federal government. This would be unfunded, and you have a regulatory environment encouraging mergers and acquisitions. The bigger will get bigger, and local broadcasters like us will have more difficulty because of the economies of scale. I hope that doesn't happen. What I think the more likely scenario is we find new processes, new partners, efficiencies, more revenue, and we simply deliver what we do in different ways.
I'm going to be a lot more obtuse than that. I don't think that we can figure out 10 or more years out in this fast, dynamic business. And I think, we have multi-year budgets that we plan for that are usually 3 years out. So I think that there's a real balance between trying to budget for the present, looking towards the future, and then being adaptive. So I focus really on the culture of our ability to be agile and adapt. And that's mostly about people, because most other things, you can adapt to technology and you can find funding sources to evolve your technology. You can't change the culture. If you don't have a culture of people that show up tomorrow willing to change and that resist change, you won't get anywhere in this business. So I think I focus on our culture, our people, and our ability to adapt always. And if I were to try to tell you what I think in 10 years, I guarantee I'll be wrong. So I think that's really where I'm at. And I think that's the core and the key to our success, is to create that culture and create the support systems that kind of enable it to exist.
So we're going into a future that is sure to have challenges, but challenges that are hard to forecast, especially in the long term. This is the last question. Do you feel more excitement about that or anxiety about that? Is this a bold new frontier, or is this a scary dark forest that we're wandering into?
I think it's two sides of the same coin. I alternate between the two daily, hourly. There's an opportunity that we might not have pursued if we still had federal funding, but boy, it's nice to meet payroll and pay your obligations when you know that you have those resources. What we do is not cheap, and society has come to expect it without understanding how it works. So I think you saw that in the federal funding process. Members of the FCC, members of Congress, the president don't understand how public media works. So I alternate between the two, and most days I'm on the positive side. So I think given the history of our track record, JPR's track record, donor support, the things that I have seen from people in the last 6 months, both just verbal support and financial support, as well as what I know is coming in our shop and from PBS nationally, 70-30 positive.
I think, we're working the problem. I don't really feel very anxious, and I don't feel excited for sure. But I feel like we have the tools to adapt and to create an effective organization for the future. And I feel like our mission has never been more important. So from that perspective, I'm excited. I look around, I look at, I've got grandkids now, and I look at their future and what the future of our communities that we live in. I've been here for 3.5 decades now, in our country, and I think that the mission of what we do is very, very important. And how we achieve it, I think, is working a problem. I think there's lots of ways to do a lot of things. And so loss of federal funding, okay, let's work the problem, figure it out. We're solution-based, we're solution-driven, and if we keep looking for good solutions, I think we'll find them. So I think we show up to work every day, very clear in our mission, and when I talk with my staff just recently, I said, focus on your jobs. Focus on telling great stories. Focus on great journalism. Focus on playing music that the audience is going to be surprised to hear and thrilled about. So if we continue to focus on our audience and focus on our mission, I think we'll be just fine.
Fantastic. Thank you both for the conversation. This has been really insightful. I learned a bunch, so hopefully the folks at home will concur that there was something to learn from all of this. So once again, thank you both for sitting down for it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.